Well, welcome to First Dunmurry non-subscribing Presbyterian Church and to the very Reverend William McMillan Library, and the latest in our journeys through the marvellous varied collection that makes up the library. And today we're going to look at something that is essentially just a sheet of paper. It is a typical example of what is called printed ephemera, in this case printed political ephemera, something that's printed just for a single purpose that isn't intended to last, and in many cases doesn't last very long. So this is something that's probably quite rare, and yet it illustrates something about the political life of Belfast over the decades, and it also has a reasonably strong connection with our denomination, because this is the election address, the election manifesto of Harry Midgley in 1938. If I hold it up, you can see it, and we can have a look at it. It's a very interesting, very rare document. There might be one in Prony, there might be one in the Lindenhall Library, but by its very nature, a document like this is the sort of thing that gets thrown away. And yet it's a link with Harry Midgley, this important figure within Labour history, within Labour political history in Belfast, whose career followed a very interesting arc, and who was himself associated, at least for a time, with our denomination. So this is the front cover of Harry Midgley's election address for the Dock constituency of the Stormont Parliament in the election of 1938. And by this time, he was a very experienced politician. He was born in Tigers Bay, and as a child had attended the Sunday school of the Independent Labour Party in Belfast and met Keir Hardie before the First World War. During the First World War, he joined the 36th Ulster Division and served throughout the war, and later wrote a book of poems about his experiences and his reflections on the war in 1924. But after the First World War, he re-engaged with politics and became active in what was then called the Belfast Labour Party. He unsuccessfully contested the East Belfast parliamentary seat in 1921, and then in 1923 and 1924 he fought the West Belfast seat, and he polled over 21,000 votes and was able to appeal to the working class constituents on both the Falls and the Shankill. When he was the candidate in October 1924 in West Belfast, Graham Walker, who has written the main book about him, says that Midgley also had three Protestant socialist clergymen speak for him: the Reverend Edgar I. Fripp, the Reverend J. Bruce Wallace, and the Reverend A.L. Agnew. Now, the Reverend Agnew will come back to. The Reverend J. Bruce Wallace was a former Congregationalist minister who'd founded what was called the Brotherhood Church, but the Reverend Edgar Innes Fripp was the minister of All Souls Church in Belfast. So two of the three clergymen who spoke for him were ministers in our denomination. And Dr. Agnew's church on York Street non-subscribing Presbyterian Church, this was the church which at this time Harry Midgley attended. When I was minister of York Street, people did tell me that he did actually join the church, although the Dictionary of Ulster biography and Graham Walker suggest he was an attender. But I think he may well have been a member. He was certainly attracted to the church in the 20s because it was a very political church, and Dr. Agnew had strong left-leaning sympathies. And one of the features of the life of the church at that time was to have open debates, bringing in people from all sorts of different backgrounds, and to hold mock parliamentary debates with people turning up in the church hall to represent different sides of the political spectrum. But Harry Midgley was certainly centrally involved in York Street in the 1920s. Now, when the Northern Ireland Labour Party was formed, Harry Midgley became the first secretary, and in 1925 he was elected to Belfast City Council for the Dock Ward. He continued to stand for the Stormont Parliament, and in 1933 was successful in being elected to Stormont. Now, this is a seat which he lost in 1938. So the big problem for Harry Midgley and for the various forms of the Labour Party was how they coped with the question of the border. And ultimately, the issue of partition, of the sectarian differences in Belfast proved too much for him, and generally too much for the Northern Ireland Labour Party. But he lost his seat in 1938 at this election, mainly because of the unpopularity of his support for the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War. For many of the Catholic population who had been keen supporters of him, they were uncomfortable with his promotion of the Republican government in the Spanish Civil War, and so a lot of Catholic voters left him in droves. And similarly, because he wasn't perceived as sound enough in protecting the Union and maintaining the border, many Protestants also deserted him. So he lost this election in 1938 quite badly. His percentage of the vote dropped by about 34%, and he went from first to third in the election, finishing behind the Ulster Unionist and the Nationalist candidate. But you can see from his election address the strongly socialist principles he was standing on. Now, he returned to Stormont in 1941 after a by-election in the Willowfield constituency in East Belfast. Now, by this time, he was giving quite a strong opinion on the border. He was arguing that it could not be altered without the consent of the people. And this led to further divisions within the Northern Ireland Labour Party, and at the end of the next year he was expelled from the Northern Ireland Labour Party, and so set up a new party called the Commonwealth Labour Party. So the Commonwealth Labour Party was both unionist and also socialist, and he was quite successful in that he was brought into the wartime cabinet as a minister, the first non-unionist to enter the Northern Ireland government in 1943. But his political career was now pointing in a particular direction, and in 1947 he resigned from the Commonwealth Labour Party and joined the Unionist Party. As a Unionist member of the Stormont Parliament, he was made a minister once again, first as the Minister for Labour and National Insurance, and then ultimately the Minister for Education. So his own personal career ultimately was very successful, but for many of those in the Labour movement, he was perceived as having turned his back on his original principles. In later life, he became a member of the Orange Order and the Royal Black Preceptory, and a lifelong supporter of Linfield Football Club. He also became chairman of Linfield. But he was a considerable political operator. He had considerable skills as a speaker, And in May 1930, the socialist magazine Forward described these by saying, "Brilliant oratory, caustic biting wit, an unassailable armoury of facts, figures and illustrations, a stirring appeal that Midgley alone can muster." And one wonders if he honed those skills, if he learnt those skills from attending the mock parliaments in York Street earlier in his career. But he was still an active and reformist Minister for Education when he died in April 1957 at the age of 64. So, another item from our library, in this case a very rare survival, and a little piece of paper that takes us back to a very controversial election in 1938. Something that illuminates the career of Harry Midgley, someone who was, at least for part of his life, part of our denomination too.